Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, Dr. Garza. It's our pleasure to be here this afternoon to provide some discussion regarding updates on grading and reporting, something that we've been having lots of good conversation about for about the last 6 months. Dr. Garza provided a charge for our committee to look at reviewing our current grading policies relative to research-based practice and ensuring that we have appropriate, consistent, and equitable practices throughout our school system. There's been some great conversation and dialogue with a variety of stakeholders, including teachers, school-based administrators, and division leadership. We're not done that conversation yet, as we want to continue to have conversation with certainly our most important stakeholder, our students, as well as our parents. And so we are here today prepared to share with you information we've gleaned from the conversation over about the last 6 months, as well as talk to you about some of our recommendations moving forward and the work ahead. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a minute to introduce those that are with us. To my left, Noelle Clemenco. She's our coordinator of secondary school support. Has been an outstanding facilitator of much of the work that's happened here. But then also seated in the back of the room, John Banbury, principal of Oakton High School, Alex Case, principal of West Potomac High School, Greg Hood, principal of Thoreau Middle School, Ellen Riley, principal of McLean High School, Scott Darwin, middle school science teacher at Lake Braddock Secondary School, Cass Hirsch, high school ESOL teacher at Stewart High School, and Nikki Warren, high school English teacher at Westfield High School. We appreciate their involvement all along and certainly taking time to be with us today. So let's go ahead and get moving here. As I mentioned, with Dr. Garza's charge asking us to look at consistency and equity across our system, there were also some other catalysts for change as it relates to grading. We've heard about some inconsistent practices across schools. I know that I've heard school board members speak to that. I know I've heard students speak to that. And so that was certainly a catalyst that we considered as we began this discussion. We also heard stories not just from students, but also from teachers and community about some of the current grading systems and how possibly that can be demotivating to our students. And finally, knowing that we were opening up the parent view in our student information system this year, our parents are going to have access to an online grade book for our students in the secondary schools. And we felt like this was a really important time for us to make sure we're getting consistency and understanding with expectations as it relates to grades. Not done purposefully, but I'll go back to that first bullet for just a minute, that inconsistent practice across schools. Our current regulation, and it's the secondary handbook for grading and reporting, which provides direction to our schools, does have a component in there that says, at the principal's discretion, research-based best practices for grading not explicitly included in this guide may be implemented at individual middle and high schools. And therein, again, not intentionally, but therein I think is part of some of the things we're wrestling with, where some folks very well-intended perhaps have created some of those inconsistencies that we're trying to address today. Okay, Noelle.
So as
Just
we
gotta push that button right there. Yep.
Thank you. As we began this work, when you think about grading and reporting, there's a lot of different directions that you can go in. Dr. Garza did give us some focus for our examination, which allowed us to kind of be a little bit more strategic in how we started to unravel the situation. I think most of the bullets up here are fairly self-explanatory, but if you look at a couple of them, I wanted to just make a few comments. On bullet number 3, the separation of work habits and achievement, that really states that students' grades will be based purely on what they can know and are able to do academically. So what that does is sort of separates out things like grades for homework completion or extra credit or plagiarism. So as you can see, that one bullet has several policies that are sort of underlying. And then the 5th bullet, the formulation of final course grades. In high school, it is the final course grade that becomes part of the transcript and is used to calculate the GPA. So this was put on the list so that we could take a look at what were the current practices and the current policies, and if it was really providing some equity and consistency and really demonstrating what a student knows and is able to do.
Okay. I shared with you that we had begun that sort of stakeholder outreach with more to come. But you can see here our attempts this year at communicating, engaging, and learning in a variety of contexts. Certainly we've had the sort of central grading committee. We've also done a lot of work with our middle school and high school principals. Just for those schools who have already started down this journey and done some work, we've picked their brains, but also we've taken advantage of opportunities at our all-county principals meetings to learn from and gain information from our middle school and high school principals. We've engaged our teachers' associations from individual meetings to having representatives from each association on our committee. We've done a couple of mass emails in trying to communicate the work of the group, the aim and intent of what's happening. So we sent one at the beginning back in February, March or so, and then we just recently sent another, and I copied the school board a follow-up just to kind of let folks know where we were at this point in time. Noelle has done a lot of work with our teacher focus groups, so we've had representation from all our middle and high schools on teacher focus groups, as well as teacher survey, which we're going to share some of the results of both of the focus groups and the surveys. In addition, we've provided information on a website that provides notes and the data from the surveys, all the things that we're doing, research, current research, all the things that we're doing in an effort to be as transparent and also informing a lot of the folks. When we sent that mass email, you can imagine I got a few replies, and a lot of them said, "Hey, can you point me to a place where some of this current research exists? I'd like to learn more." So the website is really, I think, served also as kind of an instructional tool for us as a system because it points people to some good current research that's happening today.
And we were very intentional to post documents from the focus group. Everything that was done with the 120 teachers that met 4 times was also posted so that any teacher could feel like that they knew what was happening. Everything that was done in the meetings was transcribed and posted just to really aid that transparency. So we want to sort of share with you our best thinking around where we should move for next year. Even though we had a list of many, many bullet points, we've sort of pared it down to the things we think are most reasonable to move forward in the short term. And those are stated up here, and I'm just going to talk briefly about each one. The first one is really a kind of a logistical mandate, so to speak. Teachers have grading to do and they have posting to do, and that often has been at the will of a teacher. And I say that because it's not that they're not necessarily recording the grades in a timely fashion, but they may not be putting them into the electronic grade book. And that is because in the past, parents have received progress reports at determined timeframes. So teachers fully understood their timelines, when they needed to get things in, and could meet those timelines so that the parents were getting up-to-date information. Now that our grade books will be open real-time, parents will be going in and looking whenever they are interested and seeing how their child's doing. So we kind of felt the need to put some parameters around that timeline. This was a discussion at the focus group, and it was part of our survey, and I'll show those results later. Where do we land? Is it 2 days? Is it 7 days? Is it 10 days? What is the right number? Because we know that in all the different subject areas at different grade levels, a difference between an AP assignment perhaps and a standard assignment, the amount of time that it takes for grading will differ. So therefore you can see that what we're proposing is a standard 7 days with the understanding that it could potentially, there might be assignments that are outside of that window, because we want to ensure that we're not limiting the assignments and lessening the rigor, and that we're providing ample feedback to students as well. We don't want teachers to rush just to meet that 7 days. So that was the first thing. And right now, currently, we do not have any sort of time in our policy. So that 7 days, based on the survey and the focus group, and having that caveat seemed reasonable. The second bullet is a little bit more complicated, but currently in our grading and reporting documents, teachers have the choice to use a straight-up average at the end of the school year. So each quarter on the report card is a letter grade, but in the grade book that letter grade has come from a numerical grade. So at the end of the year, those numerical grades are averaged together. And that is often what teachers use to come up with the final grade. It is also allowable that teachers look for trends, meaning if a student starts off kind of slow but then gains momentum the school year, the teacher has the right to kind of let go of that average and grade on a trend. So those two policies, those two things have been in place and are in regulation right now. What we are adding is really, we're trying to formalize something that's being done at many of our high schools, and that is using quality points. So instead of focusing on those 0 to 100 numbers, you're taking each of those letter grades and you're changing those to quality points. So an A then becomes a 4, and a B is a 3, etc. And then you're re-averaging that. Now, when I've done several calculations and looked at what this means. What this really does, because this would be an option, is it really helps a child who has a very low quarter. Perhaps one quarter the child received an F, and it wasn't a 50 or a 60, but maybe a 30 or a 40, and that is impacting the overall average of the student, and perhaps is not then skewing the grade, so it's then not representational of the student's achievement. So this provides another option for teachers to look at. And you can see the way that we've worded up here, that it is an option, but when students are failing, then this would be something that we would like for teachers to go ahead and calculate. We're also working with IT so that we can have some processes in place so that this can be done without a tremendous workload on teachers, because that is definitely a concern we want to look at. What we found when we talked with the teachers in the focus group and talked to administrators is that this practice is happening in different ways right now, so it is something we are trying to bring to a little bit more consistency. And finally, the third bullet really isn't a change at all. What we determined by looking at the survey, talking with the focus group, and engaging with the policy is that our current policy was 1 grade a week required and 2 grades recommended. And it was determined by looking at what was currently happening and talking to teachers that this seemed to be reasonable. So what we really want to do around this one is raise the awareness.
Okay, and this is a little bit repetitive, but I just wanted the purpose of this slide was to reiterate that the changes that Noelle just illustrated for us that we're looking at for this coming school year were really born out of a lot of different venues, I mentioned a lot of these, but also individual school engagement, where we're really sort of picking people's brains about what's currently happening and what's working and what are we doing. So I won't linger too long on that.
I did want to spend a few minutes to talk about the focus group. This was 2 teachers from each middle and high school that were selected by the principal, and we came together about 4 times this year. I cannot say strongly enough how committed these individuals were to this work. The engagement at each of the meetings was incredibly high, and their seriousness and professionalism was greatly appreciated. I will say that through all the meetings, we did some readings, we did a lot of collecting opinions and a lot of talking about different issues and sharing. I think a lot of the teachers expressed that they had no idea what was happening or outside of their school building, and it really was an opportunity to broaden their understanding, which is something we know we need to do on a broader scale, not just the teachers in the focus group. There were definitely some reoccurring themes as we discussed possible changes, and one of those reoccurring themes was that we have to be aware of teacher workload, that making a lot of change, you have to understand what the unintended consequences might be. So that was one thing. Another was we had a lot of conversation around consistency and equity. How consistent can we be, and consistent is not always equitable depending on the situation. So we had many conversations around that. And the last one was striking the balance between what is controlled by the division, the school, or the CT, or perhaps even the teacher. So there was a lot of conversations when setting these policies, like who should be making certain decisions and at what level should those decisions be made. We did want to take this opportunity to share the data from the teacher survey. I will say that we had a 40% return rate, which I was very excited about. This was done in May over a 10-day period, so it was not even an extended period. And it's a time when teachers are extremely busy, but we did get I think, a significant return rate to help us really inform our work. The only people who were really sent this survey were teachers who give grades. We have lots of educators in our buildings and in central office. We all wanted to take, we all have opinions, right? But we were trying to get at not only beliefs, but practices. So in order to really get at what's happening in our schools, we needed to sort of limit it to the teachers who were giving grades. Looking at some of the highlights, this particular slide isn't that impactful, but I share it because when you research changing grading systems, one of the first things they talk about is to do this work, you need to understand what's the purpose of grades for your division. You need to have some conversations about what, is this really to identify student placement in courses or to say if a program is effective? What are the kinds of things that we're trying to accomplish by grades? And these were the two things that came to the top, and I think it's significant because it was the same two things that came when we just talked to the focus group and the same two things that came forward when we did a similar activity with the principals. So we all seem to be very much aligned that we want students to use grades for their own self-evaluation, and we want those grades to really represent their achievement. Some of the particulars that you might be interested in, first of all, around the zeros. This one is probably the one we had the most energized conversation at the focus groups around because people have very, very strong beliefs. And as you can see from this slide, it says that 65% of the teachers believe using a 0 and a 100-point scale when work is not turned in. So what that says, it's awkwardly written, and I apologize for that, but basically it says if most 65% of the teachers who took the survey believe that if a student doesn't turn something in, they should get a 0, and that would be in a 100-point scale we're referring to. So there's still a strong belief in that practice. I think the overarching message that we got was giving something for nothing, which what we've seen as a standard practice is to give a 50 or 53 is difficult for some teachers to separate the mathematics from the message it might be sending to students. And the other, and you can see belief and practice is fairly well aligned there. One of the things we've had a lot of dialogue is around retakes, and this one is interesting because retakes can be done in so many different ways, and I think that's what we learned from the focus group is that some people do test corrections, some people allow everyone to do retakes, some people let some kids do retakes, some people put the grades in the grade book from every time a child takes it. Sometimes they average. I mean, there's lots of different practices. So what we found out is that, first of all, I think 65% of our teachers already have this practice, at least from the survey results. So that was a little bit higher, I think, than expected. They do believe that the associated guidelines are what is really going to be important here, and I think it's one of the things that as we move forward with policies will be one of the challenges for us to figure out where that line is and who makes those decisions. And I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier about that separation of work habits and achievement has many policies that are underlying. So here's some of the results for where teachers stand. You can see that it's a small percentage of teachers that are grading homework, okay, and 66% of the teachers currently count homework between 0 and 10%. So when they are counting it, in most cases, it has a low impact on their grade. And you can see the others. Now, the full results, we asked many questions, well, about 27 questions, so the full results from the survey can be found on that website if you are interested.
Okay. This is the last slide. We recognize a lot of this presentation is around discussion, so we want to make sure we save lots of time for conversation. In terms of next steps, well, you've just seen a lot of data that shows you that we're in a lot of different places as it relates to consistency. So we really felt like there were some things, and we talked about those earlier on, that we could do right away. But there are other things that need a little more time for additional stakeholder engagement, a little more time for professional development and building capacity. Some of the principals and schools that we spoke with who had done some of this work previously talked about a several-year sort of initiative that is not something that can easily be done overnight successfully. And we want to do things successfully and make sure folks understand and are with us as we move forward. So next steps, we're going to continue our work with the focus group. We're really only about 6 months in. We have an excellent group, as Noelle described to you. So we want to continue that work. Again, continue opportunity for professional development for all of our teachers. That engagement of our parents and students is critical. Collaborative teams, we've got some great structures in place where we've agreed to look for consistent practices within schools to the fullest extent next year as we continue on with this work. And then the goal would be, after some of these additional critical pieces that we'd like to do, to draft some policies around some of those larger items that we talked about, zeros, retakes, et cetera, for the 16-17 implementation. But we believe that continues to take some work and continued conversation.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Garza, did you want to follow up?
Yes, I just again want to thank you for your presentation and all these folks that are back here today. I know lots of discussion around this important topic this past year. There are two schools of thought about this, and I've implemented grading policies before, and I will tell you there's probably not one subject that secondary teachers are more passionate about or any more passionate about than grading. I will just tell you that. I've learned that from experience. I think y'all could agree with that, right? So in light of just the compelling need to address these issues, but also balancing that with our teachers having a say and going about this the right way. And also, I think we've had limited opportunity to engage our students and also our parents in this discussion. We believe we need the fall to take this to the next level. In fact, Ben and I have talked about using SAC next fall. That's a group that's I think would be very instructive and helpful in this discussion as we continue the work. Yes, excuse me, I'm sorry. The Superintendent Advisory Committee, referred to oftentimes SAC. Is that correct? But not SAC after school SAC. No, different SAC. So I will tell you that there were quite a number of these things that I think we all have very strong opinions about that have been shaped by what we know the research has determined is really what is considered a best practice. But in light of budget challenges, our need, our challenges with regard to keeping our great teachers, we just felt like we needed to do this. We have one more year, but we feel like with another year we can make the substantial changes that are necessary. And in the meantime, I think the other good news is we've really, the conversation's been prompted throughout the division. I think a lot of our principals are now taking this on with their faculty and staff because they've been armed with the information. So I think we'll start to see, just because of the conversations moving forward, a lot more coalescence this year around some of those effective practices, even in advance of a policy change at the division level. So particularly the issue of zeros, and zeros, in my view, Ben and I have had some great conversations about this. A strong policy around zeros will not affect our high-achieving students in any shape or form, but it will keep our at-risk students in the game. And that's the purpose. And many, many school systems, in fact, some states have laws on this with regard to zeros, because you certainly don't want to reward students for not doing anything, but at the same time, you don't want to create conditions where after a few very, very low grades, they might as well stay home, because mathematically that's what happens. And so that's a very important discussion, but we've got a little ways to go there. With the ability for retakes, I think because a lot of our teachers are already using that, is an effective practice. But what are the parameters around that? Are retakes allowed in every circumstance? I don't think that's probably appropriate. How many retakes are required? It can't be unlimited. So I think with some really quality input from teachers, I think we can come up with some reasonable and manageable parameters around how can retakes be important and constructive part of this process of measuring learning. So that's just I wanted to add to that, and I want to thank you for your work, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Garza. And I just would reiterate, we have several board members who are going to weigh in and ask questions, and that's great. Just to reiterate, if we could go to slide 5 one more time, because slide 5, I believe, shows us the 2015-2016 planned policy updates. So these are the only things that we are actually planning to put in place or to talk about actually it's happening this fall. All the other ones, many of which are controversial like that, which is zeros and retakes and all of that, those are going to continue in conversation, not for implementation this school year. Is that?
Well, some schools already have that in place, but in terms of a system-wide division practice, I just wanted to clarify, there's no action needed from the board on this. This would become a regulation, but we felt like, this is an important topic, something you all are very interested in, and something that affects all of our schools, so we would get direction from you all, but we would reflect in regulation.
Absolutely, yeah. No, we're not acting on this at all today, but just so board members know what things maybe you want to be particularly, when we're talking about this, we have more time to discuss some of the other things because we still need to get feedback on it from the system. Okay, so we have several people, beginning with Ben and then going to Ms. McLaughlin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few things I want to weigh on. First of all, I'd like to state just how pleased I am that the students are going to have such an opportunity to weigh in on this process. I think that's really a critical piece in getting that voice to making regulations that make sense for everybody. I want to weigh in on a few things if I could. The first thing, Dr. Garza touched on this. We've had some great conversations within the Student Advisory Council, within student leadership groups, about the use of zeros. It's a very controversial topic for teachers and for students. And I kind of want to put that out there now that student engagement is going to be a big part of this discussion moving forward, whether we want it to or not. The zeros are a very controversial issue because some students feel that is, as was mentioned, giving credit for doing nothing. That's an issue that we have to take on in a sense that we can make a policy that not necessarily punishes, but lets those students who are trying to do work, get some credit. That makes sense to me. That makes sense to students everywhere. But it is, in a lot of cases, a little bit brings down some people when we are giving 53s or 50% or whatever the number may be for doing no work. And what was really painful for me as a student, this is Ben the student representative stepping aside being Ben the student here, was when I saw a student in a math classroom one day just say, I'm not going to take this or I'm not going to turn this in because I know I'm going to get less than a 50%, so I might as well just not do it and take the 50. And to see that is a little bit disconcerting because what kind of message is that sending when grades are supposed to be a measure of how much content the student has mastered and be a self-evaluation of that. And it seems that we're being a little bit deceitful when we're in some cases artificially inflating students' grades. So that's my personal stance on that particular issue. I agree it makes sense that we have.
I'll work to convince you otherwise this coming year.
I'm looking forward to that. And
I'll show you mathematically why that's structured that way.
Understood. But that's just some personal experiences inform that. But in any case, that's a really interesting discussion. The other thing is, and I've relayed this to Dr. Lockhart and Dr. Garza, that the important thing about this action is not necessarily the specific nitpicky numbers about what we choose as a 50, 53, 48, whatever, or how many retakes we allow. The important thing is that it be equitable, because the biggest challenge for me as a student leader who has constituents across the county is that I have to see grading policies that are advantageous to certain students, disadvantageous to other students, and when it's an issue of being 3/4 of a mile down the road and having a completely different grading policy with regard to retakes and not turning stuff in, that's not fair to our students, and we are doing a disservice to them by allowing that to continue. So I'm so excited that we're having this discussion with the main premise of this, wanting it to be an equitable system. That's the most important part of this discussion. I cannot say that enough. On the issue of retakes, I think it's really a best practice that a lot of our teachers are already doing in their classroom because they want to have their students give their students the opportunity to show that they've mastered the content. Teachers a lot of teachers are doing that. We're trying to, set up a policy around that. That's good. We just need to leave. The way I feel is that we need to leave teachers and students the wiggle room to have a discussion and come to a consensus and agreement that works between that individual student and that individual teacher to match both of their styles. So with that, I think the most important thing that we can do here is find a happy medium for everybody involved. I'm sure that I'm not going to get 100% of the stuff that I as a student want. My peers are not going to necessarily get the exact things they want because there's just such a wide range of opinion. But finding that happy medium, getting to that point where there's equity and consistency across the division is the most important thing that we can do in this discussion. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Press, and we will be counting on you to continue to be very involved in this conversation. Ms. McLaughlin, to be followed by Ms. Strauss.
While my colleagues know my background in selective college admissions, I do want to make sure anyone who's watching or listening understands that I'm going to be speaking from that background of selective college admissions, that I very much appreciate Dr. Garza's attention to this effort. I appreciate the service of the committee members. I'm deeply appreciative that we're including our teachers at the very start because they are on the front lines and understand the experience. To Ben's point about why we need to have the students, without question, there are things that only the students know, being on the receiving end of grading and what it does to their lives and their learning experiences is going to be so vital. And as parents, we also have a perspective too. We hear time and again that people move to Fairfax County because it's one of the best school systems in the United States. And in a school system with a high percentage of students going on to four-year colleges, some of the best in the country especially, it's a reality. We need to understand who do we serve in this county, and we serve people who want their children to be competitive. So it's in that context that looking at where we are, first I want to applaud Dr. Garza for not rushing this. This is a very comprehensive approach. I think you're looking at important things, but to rush it means mistakes could occur in the implementation, and that would be the worst thing we could have happen. So the timeline I'm comfortable with. Where I'm uncomfortable right now in what will happen in September, the third bullet, ensure that teachers are meeting current policy requiring of 1 grade per week, encouraging 2 grades per week. As a high school parent, I can tell you, talking to the students, talking to the teachers, that is a huge teacher workload problem and a student workload problem, volume of homework load, volume of work these kids do outside the classroom. Our high schools are on block schedule. Sometimes that means you're only going to meet twice a week in that class. If you go with 2 grades per week, those teachers are feeling the pressure to make something due every time the child enters that classroom, whether it's to take a quiz, to take a test, whether it's to do some sort of homework, project assignment, chapter outline. These kids don't get to go in and enjoy the actual passion of learning because they're constantly preparing something else to get graded on. And so when you think about our AP courses especially as a perfect parallel to college professors require usually 2 midterms, a final exam over an 18-week semester, and maybe a paper. They're going to have maybe 5 markings for 18 weeks. If you have 18 markings in a 9-week quarter, these kids and these teachers have a tremendous amount of work that is constantly being graded and assessed. So when I used to ask the teachers why we couldn't bring down the volume sometimes, they pointed to that and said, I'm expected to have 2 grades per week in the grade book per student. So I would just caution that where it's saying encouraging 2 grades, I really don't want to see us encouraging that. I'd like to see it 1 grade a week is more than enough for assessing a child over a 9-week quarter.
I think the challenge we have is coming up with a policy that works in all cases. And I know this was the current policy. This is what our teachers were recommending. Is that correct? At the same time, you also want to give the students a fair chance to the other example of in higher ed, we only have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 grades for a semester. I think that's problematic as well. Because certainly it's impossible for, I think, parents then to monitor progress of their student. So I think it's finding that balance between not increasing the teacher workload, but also providing an opportunity for parents to be aware of how their child is progressing. But I think this is, Noelle, you may want to weigh in on that, but this is our current regulation, and our teachers felt like it was...
Yes, this is currently what is in the handbook. I will say that we did have some conversations around this, and I think some of the question is around the magnitude of the assignment. What kinds of assignments are we talking about? Are we talking about more formative exit tickets? It's about giving students feedback, right? It's about providing kids and parents information about where they are in the learning, and looking for smaller ways to provide formative feedback is what I think this is intended. I do see where it can be a workload issue. It definitely can, and depending on the subject area, it's easier to take care of in a math classroom perhaps than it is in an English classroom, depending on how they approach the subject. So there is some variance there.
The other challenge, though, too, is our elementary school teachers have, on average, 28 to 30 students in their class. Our middle school and high school teachers, depending on how many sections they're teaching, they could have up to 150 students. So I worry a little bit about the universality here, because the workload demands for a high school teacher to grade 150 assessments, and could be up to 300 assessments per week, is different than the elementary school teacher who only has those 30 students, and they don't have to necessarily have one grade per subject area at the elementary school level. So I think we have to be really, really careful with that one. The bullet above is the one where one of my colleagues remind me to be zen right now, and I appreciate the reminder. That one worries me, and this is where I'm putting my college admissions hat on. Anytime we're going to do something that might change the way we grade and assess at the high school level, we have to be careful the impact that has on the child competing for college admissions at wherever it is. So maybe it's just a matter of understanding a little bit better of what that's going to look like. But my initial fear is when we use the 100-point scale for grading on rubrics or anything else, it allows for a wonderful degree of gradation. And when we changed our grading policies back in 2009 with Fair Grade, purposely the community supported pluses and minuses to have that gradation. But if you do quality points, my concern is it's no longer, the 89 to 87 is going to be your B plus, and your 86 to your 83 is going to be your B, and your 82 to 80 is your B minus. It's a 3.
No, there are gradations, and I
Okay.
don't have them in front of me. I'm
Okay.
sorry, but there are like a B plus. I want to say is a 3.3. I don't have it in front of me, and I apologize.
So you're going with the GPA quality points that we use?
Yes.
Okay, so in terms of the rubric for the teacher and the student, they'll still be getting scored on what could be 25-point assignment or a 100-point test. It'll come down toward the calculating it as if it were on a 100-point scale, and then it gets assigned the quality point, and then the quality point is how you average the grade?
This is purely for the final grade of the course. So you're taking the first quarter grade,
Okay.
and you're changing that to the quality points, and then you're averaging the 4 quarters and final exam to get the final. This is not assignment by assignment. We
Okay.
do have the option of teachers using a 4-point scale or a 100-point scale currently in our handbook, and that came in 2009 as
Yep.
well.
Okay.
But what we're talking about, we're not asking for all of these translated grades throughout the quarter. It only happens at the end of the year.
It's quarter by quarter to the end?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the intent is to benefit the student.
Right.
So it
Okay.
wouldn't be to use to the detriment. Just like trends, I know very few teachers who would look at a trend and use that to the detriment of a student.
Thank you. I mean, that reassures me a lot more about where we're going with that. Just one final note. I know that a lot of this the committee is going to continue to look at, and I just wanted to offer some thinking about the zeros. Again, from a parent perspective and what I've heard from students. I really hope we'll consider the incomplete. It addresses the concern that Ben's talking about where students just decide not to do it at all. And certainly that was the community backlash and certainly teachers' concerns too about, well, I'm just not going to do any work at all. So the incomplete I think would be great. What I will say, Ben, I don't know if you experienced this, but I heard this from students. A student could be rushing to class from their lunch break. They forget to stop by their locker. They forget their homework assignment. They go into the class, and believe it or not, some teachers have said, no, you may not go back to your locker. No, I'm not going to consider it for late work. You have a 0. And that's the type of mindset where, some teachers just feel like, you know what, you didn't have it then, you don't get it turned in. But even when our college professors accept late work, when they say, you know what, not happy about it, this is my policy for how much points I take off, but they're not giving kids zeros. That's where I am such a supporter of eliminating a zero where the child, wanted to be doing the work, something did happen, and they have now an enormous hole to try and dig out from under. So, yep. So I think that
Some students, if you give them a zero, they're off the hook. I think we'd much rather consider a practice of giving them an incomplete and stay after them to get the work done.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to make sure that was, part of the dialogue. But again, I want to echo what Ben said, most especially that consistency to allow fairness across the county with best practices, I think will be a win-win for our students. It's a win-win for our teachers too, so that even within the same building, they'll feel like they're operating with a shared vision. So thank you again, everybody who's involved in this, and Dr. Garza, and to our former chair and vice chair who were involved in this. Bringing this to us today is so vital because the community is going to be talking to us and wanting to understand where things are. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. We are running a little bit behind, so I appreciate everyone's input. Ms. Strauss, to be followed by Mr. McElvain.
Thank you. I do want to echo, I'm very appreciative of how careful this is rolling out, because I know when it first came to the attention of teachers, particularly, that this was being considered, there was a lot of fear, I think, because I think people understand that there is a lot of differences across schools in the county, and the fact that you are looking so carefully at teacher voice, at student voice, and at some point, obviously, the parents will weigh in. So I think that you are displaying the right sensitivity, because in the end, we're going to have to find some commonality here. I've reminded teachers, when the grade books are open, while kids, you are only going to see your own child's grade book, but oh my, at that point, you will be able to see immediately where there are tremendous differences, and we need to bring that in, and then the teacher then would understand that we need to do this. So high marks for the care and the continued focus groups and asking for input so that when we finally finish it, when you finish it, that there is a sense that we are doing this to advantage kids, to be accountable, to be honest, and that teachers' professional recommendations are being taken into consideration. One of the things that we always have to remind everybody: high school is not a process of weeding kids out. High school is a process of getting everybody graduated. So, and I think that's the tone. And Dr. Garza, she went. And I think that's as you. But I think our realization that our job is to get kids graduated is in the best way possible, and that's the underpinning for this. So I really do appreciate that. It will be interesting to see where we end up. I don't have an opinion on any of these. I trust you, particularly as I hear your in-depth conversations with everybody. We will get to a better spot, reassuring everybody that it'll be accountable, it'll be fair, it will be open, and we will move forward very, very carefully to make sure it's well done. So high marks for your process so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McElvain, to be followed by Mr. Moon.
So I'd like to echo everyone so far in saying that I do believe this was a thoughtful approach, and I appreciate the elongated time period that you're spending on it. I want to talk about the first change that's up there, and this is something I've talked in depth with both teachers who are very close to me physically and those who are not, and having grown up in a house where reams and reams of paper get piled up very quickly from tests and papers, this one was definitely popped out at me. And I will tell you that 7 days is absolutely not enough for grading, particularly as Ms. McLaughlin mentioned, middle school and high school papers when you're dealing with upwards of 150 students, especially in the English and social studies areas. And, what this practice will actually encourage is for teachers, which they have been doing over the past decade or so, is adopting more and more bubble tests so that they can get things graded more quickly. And unfortunately, that's a perverse incentive because with the POG, we're trying to get students and teachers to embrace, more project-based learning. That includes the 3 C's, 4 C's. We certainly don't want to see more bubble tests. So that is my one concern with this. I think 1 grade a week is perfectly fine. We'll see how the quality point piece goes, but I would recommend looking at this, and then certainly when the communications go out, make sure it's emphasized that there is a caveat, a very big caveat to this.
Yeah, I think this is, I'm sure that Stephen will have a comment on this, but I know that some time was spent on this with the committee about what is reasonable for us to expect, and it's trying to find that balance between now we're going to have this system turned on and parents are going to be watching this, and they're going to be expecting grades to be reflected in this grade book. And this is not only, to just provide that balance between keeping parents as engaged and purposeful partners with us, but also to help protect our teachers and saying, hey, you need to give teachers, time to so to me, it's trying to find that balance. They have 7 days to post assignments. You'll note that there was a recognition that major projects and papers would require additional time to ensure quality feedback if you'll continue reading. So I believe that there was some lengthy discussion about is this reasonable for the teacher?
This was part of the survey. We asked them about how long it takes them to grade different types of assignments. We then gave the survey data to the focus group, and they worked in small groups to sort of analyze that data. There definitely was the need for the caveat, for sure. That was obvious. And the other piece was they wanted to be sure that it said school days and not calendar days, just because we didn't want to be held accountable for people working on the weekends and holidays, so to speak. But this was looking at all the groups, sort of the consensus. Do you want to turn it to the teachers? Do any of the teachers want to?
Yeah, I just want to say again, it's 7 school days, so that's 11 calendar days. I'm sorry.
You have to come to the table.
Oh, okay. Sorry. You're going to be famous now. Notorious for something I'm not sure about.
I guess that one. So yeah, so just to say that this is 7 school days, and which is ultimately 11 calendar days, because if you want to throw those 2 weekends in there as well, and it is caveated by the type of assignment. So if it is something that can be quickly and easily turned around, understandably, by parents and students, then 7 days is reasonable. But then you get that extended time for like essays. If you have 150 essays to grade, there's no true deadline on that. It's just a reasonable period of time with that. So we did all agree that it's doable.
And I'll tell you with electronic systems, because in my other systems I've been in, we had them. The thing we also don't want to have is, and I know our teachers don't do this, it's just these other systems sometimes, is waiting till the end of the period and then all of a sudden a student has 20 grades in the grade book. And then there was no meaningful time for the parent to engage with the system and their child and help improve the grades. So it's also that trying to prevent that also from happening as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Moon to be followed by Ms. Evans.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm willing to accept the recommendations to go forward at this point in time. But I am going to go into something a little different and ask either Dr. Lockhart or Dr. Garza whether we have considered looking at this particular issue that I'm going to be asking you, or we will ever be looking at this particular issue. A few weeks ago, I had an opportunity to take a look at transcripts of a group of students at a particular high school, very good students, good grades. And when it came down to one particular teacher, a particular subject, grades seemed to be lower than other grades. And the comment was, that's very good grade for that particular teacher and that particular subject. So the question that I have is this. The grade variation amongst different teachers at a given school, and also grade variations among different schools in the county, Is that something worth looking into?
Oops. Okay, the last one. I'm going to get to your answer, Mr. Moon, and I would invite Steve to weigh in too. We do need to look at establishing minimums and maximums on grades because that's where a lot of the inequity can often occur. So, for an example, if we're in 2 different Algebra 1 teachers' classrooms in the same school where there's not a defined grading practice or policy, I might count my test 50% of the grade, and Mr. Velkoff counts his test 30% of the grade. Well, I can tell you which teacher I want my child to be in. That in of itself is something we're going to have to tackle this next year, to have ranges of how much major tester projects can weigh. That's the step in the right direction with what you're talking about. This is so nuanced in terms of just classroom practice, looking at grades. I think that would be way far down the line for us to tackle. I think it's something very appropriate for our principals to look at. I know many of our principals look at grades within content areas to establish potentially where there might be outliers. I think having quality CLTs, collaborative learning teams, also help us make that a little bit more aligned and equitable. Although you all know, this is very difficult to have, and nor would we probably want all of our classrooms to be completely regimented. But with regard to grade inflation or lack thereof, that would be very difficult, I think, for us to tackle down the road. But certainly something I think it's good at the campus level to have discussions around. Did you want to add to that, Dr. Lockhart?
The only real thing, I think you covered all the things I was going to say. It's just the conversation that principals would be having in their schools as it relates to grade distribution. So I have several sections of a certain class. They're going to be, or should be, looking at that grade distribution in each of those classes. So when they see, geez, how come in this section, 50% of the students got a D or an F, that raises that flag for a conversation, for maybe it's professional development or whatever it might be. So that would be the only other piece I'd
I can tell you, several of these principals I know sitting back here, we've actually had conversations about this. I think Dr. Banbury, I know Alex, I know John Banbury's actually done some analysis of his grade distribution. You may have as well, Alex, at the high school level.
Just came back up on
And Ellen, I don't know if you... So, and Ellen, you probably have at the high school level as well.
We like to correlate it to see also if our APs are matching with the number, getting a 5 or they're getting an 8. So we do all that grade distribution to see if we're in line.
And I know our middle school principals have been doing a lot of that work
But
too.
do we also ever consider the variation among different schools? And who does that? I mean, at a given building, principal could look at different teachers.
It's been impossible to do that to the extent you're speaking of, Mr. Moon, at this juncture because in absence of having defined policy around it, that's why this grading policy is important. I think down the road, once we establish a tighter division-wide policy around grading, I think we would then be in a position of looking at grade distribution across the system and maybe learning something about that. Right now, it would be really difficult to analyze that from a research perspective because you don't know what the value of that is anyway. Because the way that a teacher might be grading a test may be much higher weighted than the other. So I think this is heading us in the right direction to be able to look at it system wide.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moon. This is a really important conversation we have not really had a chance to have yet, so everyone's interested, and I appreciate that. I'm going to try not to rush anybody. I have Ms. Evans to be followed by Mr. Velkoff.
First of all, thank you for tackling this. I think it's a really important topic that we're handling here now. I did want to make a couple of comments and had a couple of questions as well. On the zeros, I have to say, the first time I heard, the no zero policy, my gut reaction was just, if you don't do the work, you should have a 0. That was my gut reaction. But then when I started looking at the math of it, I started rethinking that. So I'm just wondering if part of this it needs to be a reframing of the conversation. Right now, we've got a 0 to 100 scale. If we go to 53, basically we will be changing that to a 53 to 100 scale. So that would suggest, and as I understand it, if you try, if you do something, if you turn something in and try, you wouldn't be getting a 53 then, or you wouldn't be getting a 35, you would be getting something above a 53, correct? In other words, if somebody turned in nothing, they would get a 53. Is that what the idea is behind that?
So these things can be implemented in a lot of different ways, but typically students who do something
Yes.
get more than a 53.
Right.
But if a student did their very best and
Yes.
earned a 35, then usually a 53 would be recorded. So there may not be a difference in
I
that
see.
case,
I
depending
see
how
what
the
you're saying.
policy is written.
Oh, okay.
But
All
there's
right.
not always a difference.
Okay.
So the policy, if it were written from a 53 or a 50, that means that's the lowest grade
It's
recorded.
the lowest possible.
So basically, though, what we're doing is we're changing the scale. We're changing the
Correct.
scale, and I think it's important for people to understand that we're changing the scale to a different scale. Secondly, going to the separation of work habits and achievement. I don't know how many years ago it was, but a few years back we changed. We could no longer take grades. Lower attendance would not affect grades. And I know there's a difference of opinion on that too, whether that was a good change or a bad change. You know, some people feel that reduced the ability of teachers to get kids to come to class. Is that something that's being revisited or no? No, that's not being revisited. Okay. Thirdly, IB grades. I have, particularly at the middle school, I've heard from parents, variety of parents, who feel that sometimes the grading is so complex well, I'm particularly talking about Glasgow, frankly, where they feel that it's very hard for them to understand the grading. Is IB a different thing? Is that something that you're looking at separately or as part of this?
So with the IB, and specifically at Glasgow, they really try very hard to be purist and use an 8-point rubric, which makes it a little bit more complicated to record grades and to report out. I think there's more gradations than a 4-point rubric, and they do some parent information about an 8-point scale, but it is kind of an alternative scale, which would fit under that caveat of implementing research-based best practices that we currently have. So in our grading and reporting handbook, we have a 100-point scale and we have a 4-point scale. And Glasgow, for many of their assignments, use an 8-point scale and have to do they have worked with IT and with our support to make that work, to meet some of the different qualifications that IB has in place.
But shouldn't that be reviewed for consistency as well?
And that's one of the questions that Dr. Locker and I have had, is that we have widespread practices, and as we try and bring people back together and people are very married to what they've been doing, where will we find that sweet spot, so to speak, that brings us all back to together and have that consistency and still tries to honor some of the innovative things that have been doing.
Okay.
But yes, that will be part of the conversation.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I do think that any grading system that's very difficult for parents to understand, I think it needs to be reviewed. And lastly, I would just echo what Mr. McElveen said about workload, and I appreciate that there's more time being given to the longer assignments, and perhaps one way to do that would be to take the longer projects and break them down somehow. But I agree, we have to be, in everything we do have to take into account teacher workload.
Thank you. Mr. Velkoff, to be followed by Ms. Reed.
I'll start off with the 100-point scale question. So one thing I notice about it is, if we think of school as, in some sense, preparation for going into the adult world, I don't know of any evaluation system in a business which relies on a 100-point scale. I've seen 1 to 6, right? Maybe the 1 to 8. So if you're getting a 0 on something and there's this 50-point gap just to be acceptable, something's not right there. So I'm actually very much in favor of essentially narrowing this, and I'm still not sure I can distinguish an 87 from an 88. How does anybody do that, right? And even on a math test, right, some people will say, well, okay, you got the answer wrong or right, but then some teachers will say, well, show your work, and maybe you made a flub up at step 3, which, et cetera. You got my point. So I actually am interested in hearing about scales that are not 100-point based. Second thing that came up, there was raised the question, at what level should decisions be made? And one of my favorite words is the principle of subsidiarity, which is that decision-making should be made as close to the bottom of the hierarchy as possible. So given the choice, right, it should be the teachers. Now, of course, the problem that we have is that there are decisions, I think, being made at the teacher level or the school level that are creating inconsistencies. But I think there's a great principle that can be applied to how to make that decision. I'm concerned about the tension between standardizing and autonomy. And one of the best presentations I remember on this board was, I think it was 2012 from South Lakes High School. Their high school had indigenously decided that they wanted to have a grading policy in the school. So I assume that you're all familiar with the work that was done out at South Lakes. And I think in an ideal sense, it would be great if this process leaves everyone feeling with the level of involvement and autonomy that I think those teachers felt that they had the ability to drive something that they could believe in. So I am a little worried about making sure that we get the buy-in. And I'm just going to ask one question. I'll get in trouble for this. So I was going to ask the question, why do we have grades? Which you answered. You said it was information to students and information to parents. And then I realized I wasn't asking the right question. Why do we have letter grades? Because if the purpose is information to students and information to parents and even to teachers, why do we have grades? Anybody willing to take that on?
Yes, I go back.
Okay, maybe we'll just leave that one hanging out there for later discussion, unless anybody wants to try. Let's keep it in mind. Thank you, Mr. Belkov. Ms. Reed, to be followed by Mr. Stork and Ms. Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Following up on the issue of workload, I can imagine that this would be an increased workload for a teacher, adding more frequent grades online and then anticipating the amount of parent questions and comments that would result from seeing that information. I guess I wondered, have you received that kind of input from your extensive list of participants, which, by the way, it looks like you were very thoughtful about making sure that you cast a wide net for input. So is that a concern that is bubbling up, both the putting the grades in as well as particularly the parents, being more active in terms of, emails and phone calls and things like that?
So in general, most of the conversation on workload was the concern around retakes and the workload that can create, because it's creating new assessments, grading more assessments. That was probably more of the focus of the workload. I think the opening of the grade books in general, which is sort of a separate issue that was happening before we started this grading work, has some teachers wondering about how that will be when parents can look at grade books all the time and what type of communication. And I haven't been intimately involved in the pilot, but I would say that what I've been hearing is that that has not caused a excessive increase in parent communication. As far as recording grades, we have electronic grade books now, so teachers are very used to recording in their grade book. We're just trying to give them some parameters, both to just to aid communication, set expectations, both on the teacher and parent side.
Right, but it sounds like it'll be more frequent, once a week or something, right?
Well, once a
Right.
week is what we currently have, and the survey data showed that I think it was about 88% of our teachers were in that required one a week. So I'm not seeing that as an incredible workload change.
Okay, well, that's good feedback. Thank you. I have a question then in terms of the role of the principal. I'm looking over at the principals now. To what extent do you have any opportunities to influence how a teacher establishes their grading practices? In other words, do you as a school have any consistency in, using zeros, doing the retakes, et cetera? Or is it completely letting 1,000 flowers bloom in the schools? Or is it depending on the principal? Who wants that one?
So certainly one of our major thrusts has been consistency on the collaborative team level. Depending on the school, some schools have gotten to the place where they've rolled it up from a collaborative team level to a department level all the way to the school level. At my site, we've gotten to department level in some places and got stuck in others just looking at the difference between art policies versus math policies and English policies for some of the issues that have been brought up today. How long it takes to grade an assignment, how much things should be worth, what's the appropriate scale to use, is quality points or total points the best way to provide feedback to kids. I think we're proud to be consistent at the collaborative team level, and we're definitely hoping not to unearth any inconsistencies as we go to the online gradebook in that area, because we don't want to put ourselves or put you in the position to have parents emailing saying, I really want Miss Smith because that seems to be a better gradebook than Mr. John. So that's where we're at right now.
And I'll just add to that a little bit. I think this discussion that's going on right now has happened very similarly at schools over the past many, many years amongst teachers. Some of the same concerns. This is not the same kind of system we're talking about that we went through as children or that we learned when we went to school. And over the years, I think looking at the research, and somebody mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned about the grading piece, is that I think once you just begin to look at the research, doing some work around this, working together in teams, you really start to realize that, wait a minute, the whole purpose of this is really about not giving students the option to fail, but looking at it and saying, wait a minute, how do we make sure that idea of incomplete or insufficient evidence, whatever you call it, to me, that's just really just a placeholder. Because no student should you be able to fail, is that if you have that eye, you shouldn't get a grade in that grade book until you're able to pass the class, because we want them to master the standards. So I think the same discussions that happened years and years and years at the middle school level. When Ken O'Connor's book came out, 15 Fixes for Grading, back in 2006, I think a lot of schools started work around that, immediately recognizing this is something we got to do. And then about 3 years ago at the middle school level, we got together as a full group of middle school principals and said, wait a minute, we need the equity across the board, across all of our schools, and recognize this is what's right for kids, and we got to start moving along now.
A big challenge, too, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point it out, one of the questions that we had concurrent to Dr. Garza and Dr. Lockert's questioning is we have students coming up from middle schools that have grappled with this for many years. How are we as high schools responding in kind to make sure that there are supportive practices that kids have experienced for several years now already in grading?
Thank you. And to further on this point of inconsistency, I guess I'm a little concerned about this time between this school year and then the following school year, recognizing that you want to be thoughtful. I understand that. But meanwhile, we have, these wide inconsistencies or variations in the practices, right, which then result in grades. And yet all these kids are competing for a spot at TJ or a spot at UVA, or it might affect even their honors grade and whether they get the bump. So I guess I'm just throwing out there, Do we acknowledge that? I mean, in the short term, for example, as part of a college application, would the counselor indicate, well, this school has a practice of using zeros or not using zeros or doing retake, whatever. I'm just wondering, in the short term, how are we going to handle that, acknowledging that these things will be addressed eventually and thoughtfully?
I mean, I can jump in. I recognize the question's a really good one. And we've thought about that as we looked at all the feedback we got and the data we received and the things that we thought we could do fairly quickly. We just felt like we needed that little bit more time to do it as successfully as possible and not to be having to undo something that we didn't take our time with to do really well in the long term.
Boy, am I supportive of that.
In the short term, however, I don't think it's, we're just sitting on our hands waiting to make some of these necessary adjustments moving forward. We talked a little bit about the work that we expect in our collaborative teams moving forward. I do believe there'll be some greater consistency just due to the fact that we've brought this conversation to the forefront, that we're expecting that folks are at least talking about that, having those conversations. We certainly are working collaboratively with our teachers on the committee, with our teachers' associations. They've been a great partner with us, with our principal groups. And so it's a fine line. But like I said, I think as we reviewed all that data and started to really think about what do we want to make sure that we do well and have it stick and be successful, we felt like we need this time. Just going back to the student and parent stakeholder conversation, we really felt like that is a piece that we have to have. We have to get that voice. And so that's one of the big out of the gate reasons we thought, we need some more time here. We spent all this time kind of unpacking our understanding. What are we doing as a system? Reliving some of the history that's been and where we are and where our schools to get to this point. But then we thought moving forward, we've got to have some more voices. And so those are a few of the reasons why. But like I said, I don't think it's for naught, and I don't think it means that we can't continue to make some progress moving forward in the interim. If anybody else wanted to add to that.
Thank you. It appears to be very well done and very thoughtful work. So thank you to everyone involved.
And thank you all. You can feel free to stay there. We're not, if you want to, or that's fine with us. We're, I think, almost finished with our questions and comments. So Mr. Stork to be followed by Mrs. Schultz.
Thank you. And we have about 5 or 6 years ago, we tried to implement, without properly doing it, a grading, eliminate zeros policy in West Potomac, and it did not fare well because it wasn't prepped right. And it was about expectations. I think in this case, people's expectations is no zero means people don't get feedback that they've not succeeded in an assignment or they've failed an assignment, but how they all fits together. So I think doing this right, particularly doing that part of it right, I think matters to the community because they need to understand what it means. And I'm going to go back to Mr. Velkoff's point, which I fully agree with, is, people are not rated from 0 to 100, and we don't even rate our staff from 0 to 100. So maybe we can start there and get the communication around that so we can do it effectively this time and better, because we got a lot of pushback, and it made my life uncomfortable for a while because it wasn't done as well as it could have been. So I think expectations are a key part of this for everybody, and I think I like the setup for this in terms of identifying some reasonable standards first and foremost, and then you get to maybe some of the harder stuff after you've had a year to use this. I think that makes a lot of sense. I wasn't clear though, and I share the concern everybody's raised about teacher workload and obviously bringing teachers along with this. So there is a standard, there is a system that everybody's part of. I realize that for some people that's going to be too much, and for others it's not enough. But I think we ought to have an expectation that's universal, and I think that's what our system has to do. On that issue, though, help me I guess understand or assess how it will be assessed, this new standard. If in fact you're saying the standard is 7 school days, somebody needs to get, for most assignments, the grades need to be posted. How is that going to be? How do we know that's really going to happen? Are we just waiting for parent feedback that says day number 10 is still not up there and people complain? Or is there some kind of internal system that schools will have for knowing that, in fact, if we're going to have the standard, then let's don't kid ourselves. Then let's at least monitor enough to give feedback to make sure that we get a 90+%, support level for that standard, or don't have it at all. I don't want to play that game. We either have it, we monitor it, we give feedback to people that are doing it well, the people that aren't doing it well, and then we in turn can represent the parents and others. Yes, we do this. You can expect it 95%, and for the few that don't, please let us know and we'll follow up on that. So what are we doing with that?
I'm actually processing what you're saying, Dan. I certainly think if we have a standard, we need to hold ourselves accountable to that standard. And so, assuming this moves forward like I'm expecting it to, that's the role of our campus principals, is to make sure that our teachers understand it, that we're communicating it with parents, that we're monitoring it where we can. I don't know that we could ever say system-wide we're meeting that 90% of the time or whatever. I don't know that we can actually measure it from that perspective, only because I think it's difficult from a macro level to know how many major assignments or projects or papers, some of the caveat pieces in it. Mm-hmm. So, I think we have to say this is our stated standard. I think that helps us in terms of communication. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be best managed and monitored at the campus level with our principals.
So is there any tracking of this at all? Do you anticipate any tracking of this?
I anticipate using similar systems we advertise FCPS 24/7, that assignments will be posted regularly by teachers. So I envision doing similar checks with my leadership team to make sure we're doing that and not only hitting it when we have a reactive concern coming from a family.
And I would just add the same thing. I think right now we already have some policies in place that we go back and check to make sure that, consistency within the school, and we'd be doing the same thing again around that timeline too. And I do want to mention something. We keep saying no zeros, and I want to steal something. Mark Greenfelder was here earlier, and he came up or said it that way, and I think it makes sense to call it. It's really about equitable grading policies, and I think that no zero fits into that. Sometimes that no zero triggers a whole bunch of things in our minds that aren't necessarily accurate. And you mentioned the idea it's really just changing the scale, and that I think equitable grading practices makes a lot more sense to call it and refer to it as that.
Thank you, Mr. Stork. Ms. Schultz?
So I want to go back to something that a couple of my colleagues have brought up, which is the question about how the team of the task force felt about the notion of the 2 grades per week. Because as a meeting manager, when Ms. Hines and I sat down with Dr. Lockhart, that was one of my initial pushbacks. And Ms. McLaughlin had brought it up first, I think just because she was at the front end of the speakers today. But having done 14 student town halls, and that's many, many, many hundreds of kids, I will tell you the concern over what I call the grind, and churning out work for the sake of work to meet a grade, and hearing some, not from the teacher side, but from the kid side, the desperation of having to make a decision that 2 things or 3 things or 4 things are due, and having to do a sliding scale of importance on any given day. Which one is the most important for me to do? Which class is the most important? Which grade has the most potential impact? And talk about being backed into a corner. What can I copy from somebody else, even though I don't really want to, but so that I can get it turned in? So I am very concerned about achieving a number so that there are enough assessments so that some kids might not fall through the cracks, and whether or not that's really the best answer, and whether that doesn't default to more workload instead of maybe a best practice. And I'm wondering what the takeaway from the task force was, because we don't get to see that part of the work, and I think that's actually one of the most important things to come out of this. Can you guys comment on what some of the task members thought?
We'll have some of the teachers come up and talk. I will tell you that out of all of the different bullets we were considering, we probably spent the least amount of time on that one just because we already had a policy in place and we didn't see getting any more rigorous. So let's see what the teachers...
Definitely the fact that this was put on the agenda more as a reinforcer. I would say there were so many things that were potential changes. We didn't weigh this on the leadership level as much. So the conversation here today is something I think we will take back to the group to say that it is such a significant consideration. As a principal, more often than not, I'm confronted with parent concerns on the other end of it. It's been so much time, and I haven't seen the progress report reflecting assignments to the degree I would expect, and then processing through what's reasonable, balancing the parent stakeholder, the student stakeholder, and the teacher stakeholder.
But that comes to effective communications and setting expectations that we don't want to turn kids into paper mills and churning out worksheets. And the really salient understanding at the student level, and not just seniors, seniors, sophomores, juniors, even some sophomores, of understanding the quality, why are we doing this work? And Mr. Velkoff asked the question about why grades. That may be, the bridge over the River Kwai, or maybe a little too far, but that they're doing work for the sake of a grade instead of having the time to be analytical with information, to absorb information. I'm not saying that everybody should have a Socratic seminar, but whether we're prepping them to churn out something so that we fulfilled some regulation somewhere versus what is the quality of the work that we're expecting them to do? And then it starts to answer the question that Mr. McElveen brought up of, is 7 days? Well, 7 days for what? 7 days for every student to have 2 assessments per week, per class. Once you start multiplying that out, and I don't remember where it was, but there was some teacher once who did a run-through for us, and she calculated the number of students and the number of assessments and the number of grades and it was a stunning, dizzying spinning of numbers when you get to adding it all up. Like 2 doesn't sound like a lot. 2 times the number of students times the number of weeks times, it adds up. And so then it's, now I'm wondering if it's not just, our version of an SOL. We're teaching to the regulation. The regulation says 2 per week. Why?
Well,
who says?
Ms. Schultz, you bring up lots of complex
I know,
issues. And
I know. I'm wondering
but
if
it's
this was discussed
though,
at the task force level at all.
This is important conversation, though, and I know probably not one we can have necessarily today. But, the workload of students, grades just one part of it. I don't think, in just my conversations with teachers and students throughout the system, I hear that too. I don't know that necessarily that's a function of our grading policies always. I think a big part of it is just the curriculum and what our teachers and students are expected to get through. And I'm looking at the teacher here at the end. How much is expected of our students with regard to what courses they take and the load that they take? I think there's many complicating factors. I think quality of the assignments that our students are giving, our teachers are giving to our students. I think that's certainly something I know our principals are talking about. I know our teacher leaders are talking about as well. So there's a multitude of factors that impact how our students feel in terms of just the grind as you described it. I think you wanted to add to that.
This speaks really to the authenticity of the assignments and making sure that they remain meaningful, that they aren't just paper mills churning out worksheets. And I think that the best thing to come out of this will be heightened awareness. As Noelle pointed out, this is already our policy that we need to bring to our CTs and our buildings. And within the CTs, we can talk about what does a meaningful assignment look like in our team. So what does that meaningful assignment look like in math versus in English versus in theater? As an English teacher, I was very pleased to see the caveat there. I think of 7 days as impossible with 3 sections of an honors English class. Hopefully parents will recognize what is reasonable. I'm not sure what the functionality is of SIS, whether we'll be able to post sort of personal philosophies. I will advertise it on back to school night. Essays will take longer if you want meaningful feedback for your children. Now, coming back to the 1 to 2 grades per week, it's so hard to quantify what is an authentic learning experience for students because, like you said, sometimes a Socratic seminar, for people who aren't familiar with this, it's just students sitting around talking, and all I care about is seeing little light bulbs going off and students having ideas, and then I have to quantify this somehow, and it's counterintuitive. I mean, it's antithetical to the entire enterprise, and so I think those questions really do need to remain at the CT level, overseen by the department chairs and then by the subject administrators and the principals at the buildings. But what makes sense for your specific class, and how do we make that reasonable? How do we put that into effect? And I think that will really come down to professional development in the buildings and having time as our CTs and as our departments to discuss what is meaningful and how we implement this policy.
See, and that I think it is. I mean, I know it's a bigger conversation, but I do think it's dovetailed directly into this, and I think that's the natural next step. But I also share Mr. Moon's concern, and I don't know if it's heightened in my area or I'm just particularly aware of it, but the disparity from teacher to teacher within a department, department to department within a building, and then campus to campus is a very significant issue. And that issue of, an honors English student at Lake Braddock, at Centerville, at West Springfield, at South County, they talk. They may be, placed at one school because of IB or AP, and they'll go back to their neighborhood. They're on sports teams, they're in, community organizations, they're in theater with kids who are taking the same courses. And they know the disparity. And teachers within a building will know. I mean, they've come and they've said, that one teacher is known for, oh, that's a particularly tough grader. Right. So the question about how we go about this comes back to the fidelity within the department and the fidelity within the building, and then you overseeing it. And if we don't get both sides of that equation, I mean, I know the other side is a bigger part, but it is so essential. It's what the kids, it's what Mr. Press, talked about. And whether we're going to have that pulse of the kids or not, I don't know. It's a big task. Is the task force going to be ongoing, Dr. Garza? I mean, for
Yes, the task force will continue next year. We'll meet once a month, and those are times so that they can take things back and use the school planning days back at their campus level.
And you continue to dipstick in your own communities to be able to bring.
It's two-way.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So I'll say a few words, and then I have one go back. First, I want to thank you all very much for being here and for all the work that I know there are a lot more people who worked on this, but for doing the work and for being here today. I won't reiterate all the things that you've heard about the 2 grades per week, because I think I agree with all of the concerns, and I guess I'd like to see that, if we have a policy that's not really being implemented, across the board and with any kind of fidelity, then I always think we have to take a look at the policy and see is the policy the problem, So maybe if the task force is going to take a look at that I think would be very helpful. I like the thinking that we will make decisions on the upside for kids, when we were talking about, when teachers are deciding whether to go with the straight end-of-year grade or find another way to evaluate a student, that we will use that as a way to give to give a student a chance to do better. So I think that's probably what we all would like to see. So lastly, one of the things that we've talked about a little bit too is Teachers sometimes worrying about students kind of gaming grading policies, well, if I'm not going to get a 0, I won't do it, retakes and that sort of thing. And I think the question that I would always ask about that, and it's come up a little bit, is, well, maybe we're overloading our students so that they're having to make those strategic decisions just to get through the work that they have. And so I don't know, if we see a lot of that and it's something people really worry about, that gets back to student workload and stress. So those are just my observations. Okay. Any of you wanted to respond?
I just wanted to say, I think what was mentioned earlier, there's a 100-point scale, the 4-point scale approaches, but there's also what's called a ZAP policy, which is zeros aren't permitted. And that's when schools have systems in place so that students are held accountable for the work. And I think that's really where we want to go.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, and I'm going to limit everybody to just one go back, and so far we have one. Ms. McLaughlin?
Thank you. To the big question Mr. Velkoff asked, why do we have letter grades? It ties into the slide that it said survey result highlights, main purpose of grading, provide information to students, communicate information to parents about student achievement. And if that was the survey results, it is what it is. But my immediate reaction when I saw that slide was, we are communicating student achievement performances to colleges. I mean, we're a school system where over 70% of our kids are going to 4-year colleges and about 90% go on to 2 or 4-year colleges. So we already know when people come here to Fairfax County, that's a big part of the goal. Yes, we want them to be 21st century learners, but for what? To go on to higher learning. So Mr. Velkoff, if you don't have letter grades, again, going back to my college admissions background, what are they going to assess students on? Because I can tell you it is a huge problem, and that was why we did go toward normative, standardized grading approach here in Fairfax County back in 2009. It's not just college admissions, it's the ability to get scholarship money, it's the ability to be NCAA qualified. I mean, we need letter grades, so nobody lose sight of that. To the point that Mr. Moon brought up, I will share a chart with you and Dr. Garza and Dr. Lockhart that was created back in 2009, and it was all 25 high schools, and it was created during the Fair Grade Study. FCPS created the chart, but it basically gave the GPA breakdowns for all the high schools, and it was broken into 10 points, so 3.0 to 3.1 GPAs, and it was very telling because if you then took the SAT average of each of those 25 high schools when you include TJ, it did give you an objective measure to just look at, okay, if you look at the average SAT averages, but then you look at the average GPA breakouts for each of the high schools, you could kind of start to see where there might be, higher grading practices in some schools. And that's just campus to campus. Inside the building, I'll just share with you that I had a situation in my district, and my regional superintendent was very helpful working with the principal where they took the subject matter and they looked at the entire department, and one of the teachers who taught an entire subject area was so off the normative that there was twice as many kids with D's and F's, half the number of kids getting A's and B's. I mean, it was so off the range. And so to Mr. Moon's concern, whether if it's happening inside the building, that's where principals and regional superintendents can help. And if it's campus to campus, I think that's going to be something, quite honestly, that's much broader and not nearly as urgent as the work that's being done here. But there are ways to look at some of this stuff, and I'll send the chart to all of you.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I believe Mr. Velkoff has a response, and then I'm going to let you two take it outside, okay?
I was actually going to paraphrase Mr. Stork. We must disenthrall ourselves of the quiet dogmas of the past.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Velkoff. I was hoping someone would say that. Thank you all very, very much. We've gone over, but this is such important work, and you guys have worked really hard on it. Thank you for staying over the time that we were expected to meet with you. So we will take a 1-minute break and then move on to our next work session.